Okay, first of all, a quick show of hands. How many of us here are putting off work or are procrastinating at this very moment? Wow, that's an overwhelming majority of you, and that's expected. Many of us would rather be here than be buried in our work, and that's entirely okay. I'm not here to judge. After all, I'm also that student who revises not the week before exams, not a few days before, but the morning before my test. I'd rather go to sleep than wake up and cook something for myself when I'm hungry. But here's the twist. I'm also that same person who was on the 2023 national debate team. I have the highest GPA in my graduating class of 2024, and I recently secured a scholarship into college. But why am I telling you this? Because it's a paradox that often contradicts our modern approach to success. See, we've been told time and time again that success only comes to those who grind without pause, that the only path to victory is to work until you're 80. But what if, in our relentless pursuit to success, we open up a door to a silent intruder that is procrastination? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. But before I delve into the reasons on how one can procrastinate effectively, let's talk about a few reasons on why we procrastinate in the first place. Firstly, on how we live in a technological era. In our constantly revolutionizing digital world, we're often exposed to media on platforms such as TikTok. What this does is it conditions our brain into receiving an influx of information, and then our brain is used to craving short-term dopamine hits. This is harmful because it contributes to our immensely short attention span, and it feeds into our desire to avoid discomfort at all costs. What this means is that procrastination then becomes an outlet to the enormous tasks that we see as more larger and more uncomfortable for us to engage in. So we turn to procrastination as an outlet in order to avoid doing all those tasks that bring us discomfort, tasks that we feel that our attention span may not be long enough to engage in. So that's why we procrastinate. But then reason number two, on how we fear failure. And this is something that I believe is innate in the majority of us, and it's also something that I personally struggle with. Because of our fear of failure, especially when tasks are daunting and when they're difficult and when they're complex, that's when we feel that we may not meet up to the expectations that others have set for us, when we fear that our personal standards are too enormous for us to sort of be up to par with that standard. That's when we avoid engaging in those tasks. That's when we start to procrastinate. But then thirdly, on how we feel overwhelmed with everything that happens in our everyday life. As students, which I assume the majority of the audience are, we have schoolwork firstly, and that can be further broken down into subcategories on how we have assignments, we have tests, and all those other projects. But then we have to also focus on extracurricular activities, we have to focus on sports. Some of us have part-time jobs, and some of us have to engage in competitions. But all the while, we have to maintain our social life with our families and with our friends. We also need to have alone time with ourselves. But usually, we neglect that last part. We don't have time to allocate towards ourselves. We only engage in other tasks. But because we don't get enough rest, we don't prioritize ourselves, that is when we start procrastinating, that is when we start neglecting the other things that we ought to focus on. So my tip would be this, to break down those tasks into tiny little bits and recognize that the task at hand may be more minuscule than how it currently appears to you at the current present. Just because you're overwhelmed doesn't make the task that you have to do automatically more difficult, right? But then now that we understand the reasons on why we procrastinate, why isn't procrastination inherently bad? There's actually a study conducted in 2014 about the linkage between procrastination and performance. And they uncovered that procrastination isn't merely rebellion against deadlines, but it's a nuanced response to the complexities and the intricacies of the tasks that we face. There's this narrative surrounding the hustle culture that frames it to be a beacon of success, a light at the end of the tunnel. But that simply isn't the case. This narrative of the hustle culture only pushes us to work even harder, but then this hustle culture doesn't allow us to have time to prioritize, to rest. That's why we choose to procrastinate. But then, because of this, procrastination, you ought to believe this notion happening around that if you procrastinate, that brings you failure. But I would tell you that's not necessarily true. Because say you were given 1 week to work on your essays, to finish your essays and submit it on a deadline. I would tell you that most of you here would probably utilize those entire 7 days to draft an outline, to fix the tiny little bits here and there, fix up grammatical mistakes, spelling errors, and at the end of the day, sure, you'd get a polished essay, but you'd utilize those 7 days. But if you were given just 1 day, I'd argue you could still finish that essay within just 1 day. Why is this so? Because procrastination creates a sense of urgency that you can't get anywhere else. Procrastination pushes you to work more efficiently, to allow your brain to think more critically. It works faster. That sense of urgency incentivizes you to do things more efficiently. So procrastination doesn't necessarily have to always lead you to failures. So now that we've understood the reasons on why we procrastinate and why procrastination isn't inherently bad, what are the two options we're left with then? Firstly, if you want to avoid procrastination entirely, make sure to treat yourself so nicely that your body doesn't feel a need to shut off on itself through the outlet of procrastination. You have to sleep 8 hours a day, you have to eat healthy meals and all that, but I argue it's close to impossible because there's bound to be a day where it just feels longer, it feels more exhausted, it feels more draining. There's inevitably going to be one day where you lose motivation and when you start procrastinating. So then there's option 2. You procrastinate effectively. But how do you do so? If you happen to overwork yourself and you're not finding yourself to be procrastinating, the first thing you should do is to accept the very fact that you are procrastinating. Accept the fact that you are procrastinating, because lots of people fail at this step. But then secondly, I will tell you that the next step you ought to do is to enjoy your time of procrastinating to the fullest. And now I understand this is unconventional, but if you were skipping schoolwork, you're laying on your bed, not doing any work, and you're feeling guilty because you're not being productive, then that's when you aren't maximizing off of the benefits of procrastination. That's when you're limiting yourself to your well-deserved rest. That's when you aren't getting enough rest. If you're procrastinating because of the reason that you were tired, make sure that when you procrastinate, it fixes that very issue of you being tired. It fixes the issue of you not having motivation. Otherwise, what's the point? Okay, because we're so caught up in pursuing our wants that we don't take time to consider that we may be neglecting our needs. Our desire for money and success overshadows our demand for rest. We live in a world that celebrates the hustle culture, but I would tell you to embrace the radical notion that rest is not a luxury, but a necessity. Rest is not a luxury, but a necessity. In a world that glorifies the constant motion, perhaps the pause is an opportunity to recalibrate and emerge stronger. Procrastination is necessary for all of us to lead a more sustainable and a more balanced life. And for all these reasons, thank you for being a great audience. Thank you.